All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We're just going to give a few minutes for everyone to log on. So just sit still and then we'll begin. Um, I'm just going to test something here and then we'll get started. Okay, so as we're waiting for others to join, I think we'll get started with just some housekeeping things. So I guess I should start by introducing myself. My name is Victoria, and I'm the Habitat Program Manager of our Rights of Way project here at the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And this webinar today is part of a three-part series that's taking place this summer. So this is the third installation of our webinars. We had two other webinars earlier this summer, and those recordings are available online. And I'll share the link of where those recordings are if you were unable to attend. And so we're really excited to have you all here. And this might be a new platform for some of you. So in case you haven't used it before, just a few notes. So either on the bottom of your screen or the side of your screen, you might see these little functions here. There is one that I'd like to test out that's a little smiley face just to see who's on today. Make sure you can all hear me okay. If you can just send a reaction, any emoji that you want, just so I can see that you're all here and you're listening. Okay, some thumbs up, happy faces. Okay, good. We got some people on here. That's wonderful. And you'll also notice that there is a chat box. I see a few of you have already sent some messages. That's really great. Please do share where you're joining from, maybe what organization you're representing today, so we can get to know each other a little bit more. And we also have a Q&A function that's right next to the chat on that top right-hand side. We'll be using that today. Our speaker, who I'll introduce shortly, is going to be offering a few different time periods for questions and answers. So please, as your questions come up, do put them in that Q&A. We will also have a few polls today too, and that's located right next to the Q&A function, and it'll also pop up on the screen. Okay, so nice. So we see some people from, see BC. Hi from Seattle. That's great. From across the border there, from Hamilton, Niagara. Okay, awesome. Calgary. So we're really coming from all corners of the country and beyond today. That's really great. If at any point you have any technical issues as well, please do just send myself a message on the chat, and I can do my best to help you out. So, actually, before we get started, I should also share that. So, I mentioned I'm the Habitat Program Manager, and I'm located here in Ottawa, where our head office is. And I want to take the time to acknowledge the traditional territories in which we're all gathering from today. Like I said, we're all coming from all across the country and beyond. So, here in Canada's capital, we acknowledge that we're on the unceded and traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. And I really encourage you to also take the time to look up to see what traditional territory that you are joining from. And feel free to share that in that chat too if you know it by hand. But if not, there's a really great website called nativeland.ca, and I'll share the link in just a moment as well so you have that to look at. And it's a really great interactive map where you can take a look at the different Indigenous territories throughout the nation. So I'll share that, and keep in mind throughout our webinar today and also in the work that you're doing on rights of way when you go back to your day-to-day work after this, how we might be able to improve our collaboration and what ways we can engage with Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities more in our work. So, for those of you who might not know about the Canadian Wildlife Federation, we are working to conserve and also inspire the conservation of Canada's wildlife habitat. So, we are one of Canada's largest conservation organizations, and we do this through a multitude of ways. We work with educating the public, educating youth through programs such as those involving citizen science. We also work to conserve species at risk, such as bright whales, but also the monarch butterfly, and that's really led to what it is that we're going to be talking about today on rights of way. So, our Rights of Way program here that's taking place in Eastern Ontario as well as Southwestern Ontario, our purpose is really to work collaboratively with Rights of Way managers. So when I say Rights of Way managers, I'm thinking about roadside managers, but also those on hydro corridors, pipeline easements, and even the lands that are under wind farms or solar farms. And we're working to restore the breeding and migratory habitat for the monarch butterfly, but also other benefiting pollinator species. And we're doing this with this team here. And so if you've joined our previous webinars, hopefully a few of those faces will be familiar to you. And one of them in particular is going to be presenting today, and I'll introduce them shortly, like I said. So through our program, we have built and are continuing to grow our Rights of Way network. So one of these is the Rights of Way as Habitat Working Group. This is a Canadian chapter as the offshoot of the US group, if you're already familiar with that. We also have two regional networks, one in Eastern Ontario and one in Southwestern Ontario. We call these communities of practice, and we get these groups together to facilitate peer-to-peer knowledge sharing, to offer trainings, and trainings like this today, our webinars and our workshop and resources, they're available to everyone across Canada, but we also have some additional opportunities to those in those specific communities of practice. And so alongside that, just for some upcoming opportunities for the networks, we have just announced that we have a roadside training opportunity for Rights of Way managers that are in Eastern Ontario specifically. So if you're in Eastern Ontario and you're interested in joining, this is an in-person event that's taking place on August 25th in Perth at our partner Lanark County's Public Works Office. It's going to be a mix of in-classroom learning. We have a fantastic guest speaker, Rick Johnston, who is from IBM Partners based in the US, is going to impart his fantastic knowledge on IBM and passive restoration. We're also going to be doing an outdoor roadside tour to some active restoration sites. We will also have coming up the Southwestern Ontario Communities of Practice meeting as well as the Eastern Ontario Communities of Practice meeting. So if you're in either of those regions and you would like to join, please send myself an email, and I'll share my email or our network email in the chat as well. And those dates are to be confirmed, but if you're already part of our networks, then just stay tuned and pay attention to your emails for those dates. As I mentioned earlier, we had some other webinars that already took place this summer, and those are available on our website, but also on our CWF YouTube page if you'd like to take a look. Okay, And that was a lot of me talking, and I'm sure you're just ready now to hear our speaker share more about geospatial tools and how that can help us in our restoration efforts. So, without further ado, we have Vincent Fyson, who is CDF's very own GIS analyst and digital databasing technician. So he's recently completed his Master's of Science at the University of Ottawa, where he studied Blanding's turtle ecology in Ontario. And currently, Vincent is working on modeling monarch migration across Ontario, as well as creating tools that can help land managers such as you for rights of way, and among multiple other projects as well. So I'm going to pass things over to Vince, and just please give me a moment to switch over the presentations. This tech stuff can also be a little bit tricky. I've done a few of these now, so you'd think I'd be really good at it, and I try, but we'll see how this goes. Okay.
Hi everybody, if you can see me right now. I'll just wait for the presentation to come up. So yeah, I'm Vincent, and as you just heard, I'm a GIS analyst for the Canadian Wildlife Federation. And I'll talk to you about some tools that we're working on that can help manage rights of way for pollinators. So one thing just to note is that some of these tools are good for, or at least one of them is good for across Canada, but they are mostly specific to Ontario. Which they can be expanded upon for other regions, but as at this point, the focus is Monarch range in Ontario. I guess we'll get started. So sorry, I guess my internet was a bit sketchy today, so Victoria is going to be sharing my slides for me. So if you go to the next slide, please. So today I'll be covering 3 different tools. The first is the Monarch mowing map, which we just completed. The second will be some Monarch distribution modeling, which is ongoing, but we're nearing our first publication, which is our first model, which is focusing on fall roosts. And the third is a rights of way dashboard, which is still in a conceptual phase. Next slide, please. So first, I want to cover a bit about monarch butterflies since they're the primary focus of the tools. Next slide. So as I'm sure you're all aware, monarchs are migratory butterflies. So the eastern population, which is the population of monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains, travels as far as 4,000 kilometers from their overwintering grounds in Mexico to their breeding grounds in the United States and southern Canada. The migration isn't carried out over a single generation by single individuals, but instead it happens over several generations. So in the spring, it takes 2 or 3 generations to reach the northern parts of the range, where they reproduce for another 2 or 3 generations before the fall migration. The generation that undertakes the fall migration is quite a special generation. They're referred to as the super generation. So they travel all 4,000 kilometers back to the fir forests of Mexico, having never been there before, where they overwinter and begin the migration north the following spring. Next slide. But unfortunately, monarch populations are declining. Starting in the early 90s, yearly estimates of the eastern monarch population have been made in Mexico. Estimates are based off of the area of forest occupied by overwintering monarch. And since measurements began, monarch populations have reached critical levels. So only once in the past 15 years has the area of forest occupied by monarchs been measured above the 6-hectare threshold. And the 6-hectare threshold is an area determined to be necessary to sustain the eastern population of monarchs. So the threats to monarchs are numerous and include habitat loss and degradation, pesticide use, climate change. And we want to focus on habitat loss and degradation. And these tools will help with efforts to conserve, restore, and improve habitat for monarchs. And they won't just benefit monarchs. Habitat restored for monarchs can also benefit hundreds or even thousands of other insect species or plant species and other species. Next slide, please. So our main target is restoring rights of way by improving pollinator habitat. So rights of way represent a huge area of Canada that has the potential to be highly functioning pollinator habitat. So there are over 1 million kilometers of rural roads in Canada, and the verges of these roads, combined with hydro and pipeline rights-of-way, cover around 15,000 kilometers squared of land, and that's an area roughly the size of 3 PEIs. So that's a huge area of land that for the most part, or in some places, it's very good habitat already. For the most part, is relatively poor habitat. Next slide, please. So improving rights of way for pollinators isn't just about active restoration, like planting native seed, but also about changes in how the land is managed to better suit pollinators. So one important aspect is the timing of when rights of way are mowed. So we put together a rights of way mowing map to show the ideal mowing dates based on what is best for monarchs. So the dates were determined using citizen science databases such as Mission Monarch, eButterfly, and iNaturalist to determine the arrival and departure dates of monarchs. Next slide. So using monarch observations in those data sets, we were able to track the spring and fall migration, and we determined the safe dates based on the arrival and departure of the bulk of monarch observations. So for example, here I used a kernel density function to estimate the extent of monarchs by mid-April for monarchs returning up the eastern seaboard into southern Canada. Next slide. But it's important to use the bulk arrival dates and not just the first arrival, because there will be outliers that shouldn't be included. For example, sightings of dead monarchs whose origin are unknown. It could even have been, this particular sighting could even have been a monarch that's thawed out of the snowbank from the previous fall migration, or sightings of captive monarchs. Next slide. So here's the advance of monarchs 2 weeks later in early May as they first start to arrive into Ontario. Next slide. And again, mid-May as they're back to nearly the full extent of their range in Ontario. And it will take at least another couple weeks before they reach the full eastern extent of their range into Nova Scotia and maritime provinces. So next slide. So by using these methods, we can assess the arrival and departure timing across the country. And this is the result of our mowing map for Canada. So additionally, there is a mowing map for the United States. I know there are some United States listeners today. And this is released by Monarch Joint Venture. So I can provide a link for that if anyone's interested, or I think it should be pretty easy to find online as well. So before I move on to the modeling, are there any questions about the mowing map, like how it's made or how to use it, for example? If there aren't any questions, I can move right on.
I'm just going to give a reminder that there's the Q&A function that's located just next to the chat that you can submit your questions. And also feel free to provide your thoughts on the map as well. How do you envision that your organization might be able to use this map?
Yeah, so one of the challenges, of course, is whether this map is at all feasible. So if we're looking at the dates, say for the furthest southern point of Ontario, then the safe date when to mow before May 1st and after October 15th. So that might be a challenging date for a lot of rights of way managers down in far southwestern Ontario, where you typically wouldn't mow before May 1st because not much has grown yet. So there might be some challenges involved with following these dates, but these would be the ideal dates if at all possible. So maybe it's easier for, say, a hydro corridor, which is going to be mowed just to keep scrub down or brush down rather than just grasses, in which case it could be done earlier in the year before May 1st. And then, of course, we could be expanding upon this to look at not just the first arrival dates, but also the dates when breeding activity begins. And there appears to be roughly a 2-week lag between when monarch first arrive to the breeding grounds to when the first observations of eggs and caterpillars are. So it might be roughly 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks later. That would be ideal to avoid damaging any eggs or caterpillars. So anyways, so I guess we can move on to the modeling then. So in Ontario, monarchs begin their journey to Mexico at the end of the summer. And so while the exact migratory routes are not yet known, we do suspect that monarchs funnel along the Great Lakes, which act as barriers as they move south. So the purpose of the modeling is to determine the locations used by migratory monarchs so we can determine where the best locations are to invest conservation resources to aid migratory monarchs. So it'd be great if we could target all rights of way across Ontario to create or improve pollinator habitat, but we just don't have the resources to accomplish that. So the best we can do is allocate the resources available for conservation to the highest impact locations. Next slide. So one method we're working on to prioritize restoration is to model the distribution of migratory monarchs. And monarchs don't migrate continuously. Instead, they actively migrate during the day, and then at night they form roosts with other monarchs. So similar to the massive roosts that you find in Mexico with millions of monarchs, but in Ontario they're a lot smaller. So typically it's a few individuals up to several thousand in a roost. I think the largest roosts are typically in Point Pelee, where they can get up to about 10,000 individuals. Um, and they're like the roost in this photo here. And so these roosts are typically close to nectaring resources like goldenrod fields or other flowering or other fall flowers, which provide plenty of food. So we know that conserving or creating nectaring habitat near roosts or along migratory routes would be very beneficial for the species. So if we can model the probability of roost occurrence, we can determine the highest impact locations for habitat restoration. So we model, oh, next slide, please. So we modeled roost distribution using two data sets across two different geographic extents in Ontario. The first data set was from Environment and Climate Change Canada, and they had some targeted roost surveys along the Great Lakes shorelines over the past few years. So the study area for that model was a 2 kilometer buffer of the Great Lakes shorelines in Ontario. And then the second data set is the Journey North citizen science data set. So they've been collecting roost observations from citizen science observers for the past, must be 15 or close to 20 years now. Um, and so our study area for that is roughly the extent of the mixed wood plains in southern Ontario. Next slide, please. So we included 18 different landscape variables to predict monarch roost distribution. The idea is that roosting site selection by monarchs is likely influenced to some extent by the landscape. So we want to know what makes for an ideal landscape for roosting monarchs. We use land cover variables, which include water cover, urban land cover, agricultural land cover, etc. And the distance to the Great Lakes and the distance to other water sources, as well as slope and aspect of the land. We then used a boosted regression tree model to model the relationship between roost locations and the 18 landscape variables. Next slide, please. So I won't cover the full results, but we were able to successfully model roost distribution across both study areas, and the results were very similar, so it's quite encouraging. And there appear to be two main factors that affect roosting site selection. The first are physical barriers. So they may involuntarily force monarchs to select certain roost locations. And the main physical barrier and the most important variable in both monarchs was the Great Lakes. So the results showed that monarch roosts are much more likely to occur in proximity to the Great Lakes, specifically within about 500 meters of the lakeshore. It's possible that monarchs simply select locations near water, but we did not find the same relationship with other bodies of water in the study area. So that supports our hypothesis that Great Lakes are acting as a migratory barrier, which increases their chance of roosting in proximity to the Great Lakes. And this highlights the importance of having suitable habitat both for roosting and nectaring along Great Lake shoreline. So Great Lake shoreline is a perfect target location for restoration activities. The second factor that appears to be affecting roost site selection is the availability of nectaring resources. So nectaring resources may be available in multiple land cover classes that we included in the model. So for instance, we included rural roads, which might already have some adequate adequate nectaring resources, as well as agricultural lands, which older agricultural lands like fallow fields and whatnot might have some good nectaring resources. But the one that we also included goldenrod cover. And so I've chosen goldenrod cover to present here because it's an important end of summer and fall nectaring resource for monarchs, and provides a lot of the nectar for them on their journeys south. So monarch roost probability increased in response to goldenrod cover, and as well as in response to other land covers that typically have nectaring resources. So specifically here, we show that a minimum of approximately 10% goldenrod cover in a landscape is ideal for roosting monarchs. Next slide, please. So we can then use the model to map where monarch roosts are most likely to occur. So our most recent modeling iteration, I haven't yet mapped it, but this is from a previous modeling iteration that used slightly different variables, but it will look very similar to this once it's finished. And so the model will show us the locations that are best suited to target for conservation and restoration. But it can also be used to look at how future landscape changes will affect monarch roost occurrence, and at specific location, or affect monarch roost occurrence at specific locations or across a specific landscape. So there is some predictive ability too, where you can look at an area, you can see what are the landscape features in that area. If we change some of those landscape features, how does it change the probability of monarch roost occurrence? Yeah, that summarizes the modeling. So before we move on, are there any questions about the modeling work that we're working on?
We do have a question here that is just looking for you to expand a little bit more on how you identify which variables that were used in the modeling.
Yeah, so there are two ways. The first was we looked at some other papers that had done modeling of monarch distribution. So one specifically was looking at Western monarchs in the Western United States. And those are the monarchs that migrate into coastal California to overwinter. And so we copied a lot of the same variables that they used. And then also, because it hasn't been done that much in the Eastern population, we had a little bit of an exploratory analysis to look at which variables could we include that might predict monarch distribution. So for instance, slope and aspect, talking to entomologists who are saying that if you're on that southern exposures, for example, generally tend to have greater insect abundance. And same with the slope. If you have too high of a slope, then you might not get the same insect abundance as flat land. So yeah, a bit of exploratory as well as just using variables that have already been established in previous papers.
And I actually have a question for our audience. In one of your earlier slides, you were sharing, and you had a really nice photo there of a monarch roost. I'm just curious for those who are joining us today, if anyone has seen a monarch roost before. Maybe write it in the chat what your experience was if you have, or even just give like a thumbs up or something if the reactions are at the bottom. I'm just curious. I think it's a pretty spectacular thing to see if you ever get the chance to. Okay, a thumbs up. Okay, there's some people out there.
Yeah, I think in Ontario, anyways, the best locations are Peely and Long Point, as well as Prince Edward County on Lake Ontario, so Presqu'île Provincial Park. I'm not sure about elsewhere in the country or in the States. I know California has their own roosts, that overwintering roosts, which is pretty neat. But the monarchs in California are in a much more critical level than the ones in Mexico. Their populations have really declined precipitously, and they're not doing too well. So there are other conservation efforts going on for the Western monarchs that migrate to California.
We also have a few other questions that have come in. One of them is, was there also a relationship with the old field slash meadow cover, or does there seem to be a relationship mainly with goldenrod?
Yep. Um, there was so we had uh, multiple different land covers that represented some sort of nectaring resource. So agriculture was split up into both pasture and forage, and then row crop agriculture. Just because we would expect that row crops would provide far fewer nectaring resource opportunities for monarchs than would pasture and forage, which might be an old field or something like that. And then as fallow fields, and those ones that did like pasture forage, fallow fields, etc. They did have a positive influence on monarch roost abundance, or sorry, monarch roost occurrence, not abundance. Although it wasn't as strong of a relationship as it was with goldenrod fields. Um, and that might be, I mean, there might be several reasons for that, but one of the main ones likely is that goldenrod is one of the most abundant floral resources at the end of the summer and into the early fall when monarchs are migrating. So it's likely one of the most important resources for them when selecting a site.
And another question here, in your data collection, did you identify any other nesting or migrating species?
So this modeling specifically was targeting monarchs, so we weren't looking at other migrating insect species. However, there are other migratory species of butterfly found in Canada and the United States, as well as other species of migratory syrphids, and possibly some bees and whatnot. But there's not a lot known about other migratory insects. It's an area it's very difficult to study, and there just hasn't been a lot done in that area. So we're specifically focusing on monarchs for this.
All right, and that's the end of the questions that we have. We have some nice comments. I encourage people to go take a look in the comment section too.
Okay. Okay. So if there are no other questions, we can move on to the next portion. And so the last tool that I want to talk about today is the dashboard. So this is a dashboard to help track data related to rights of way restoration. So the dashboard is still conceptual, so it's not final, and it's still a work in progress. But I'll still cover what we hope to accomplish with it. So the main purpose of the dashboard is to track progress made on restoring rights of way at the upper and single tier municipality level. So from the dashboard, it's possible to see how much restorable right-of-way habitat there is, where that habitat is located, as well as what has been restored. So the dashboard is an interactive tool, so you can click on a municipality to see the rights-of-way information and restoration information. Next, next slide, please. So for example, we can zoom into a county, in this case Lanark, to see that there's the potential to restore 1,500 hectares of road verges and 1,300 hectares of hydro rights of way. It also shows us what's been done to date. The values in this is just, it's incomplete. I've only just put in a few restoration areas just for an example. But so it can give us for a jurisdiction what's available and what's been done. Next slide, please. Um, so we can then zoom in further to visualize where restoration has taken place, as well as the rights of way where restoration is likely possible. So in this case, all roads that are outside of urban centers, so roads that are likely to have vegetated verges, and hydro rights of way that are in any land other than open water, wetlands, and agricultural fields where restoration wouldn't typically be possible. So far, the dashboard displays roads informations for provincial roads, county roads, and township roads, as well as main hydro corridors. But the information that's displayed can be tailored to suit those that will be using the dashboard. Next slide, please. So there's a lot that can be done with the dashboard. For example, we want to add our modeling results to be able to visualize where priority restorations areas are. That way it's easy for rights-of-way managers to view the map and target the highest impact locations for rights-of-way restoration. Additionally, modeling results can be informative for private landowners that want to do restoration on their lands, as it might be able to provide information on, for example, where to plant a pollinator garden or other targeted conservation measures. Next slide. And oh, just one back. And of course, we're open to suggestions on what would be useful for inclusion that would help rights-of-way managers decide where to prioritize restoration or help track restoration. For example, if data tracking of habitat restoration is part of a climate change or sustainability plan, perhaps the dashboard could be used to, or could be designed to meet those needs. We're looking for input on what would be useful for municipalities to have included in the dashboard. So a part of this could simply be as a tracking platform for municipalities or other land managers, because it can be useful to have a central location to store spatial information on restoration activities, as well as an easy way to view the information. Next slide. And yeah, so that's just a summary of the dashboard. So if you have any suggestions or questions about about the dashboard or any needs that could be met with it or applications, those would be great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vince. That was really fantastic. And I'd just like to add that for if you have any feedback or anything that you'd like to comment on, you can send a message in the chat or through a question, and we have the option to invite you to the stage. So if you wanted to share it out loud rather than typing it out, if that's easier for you, you can certainly do that. We also have a couple poll questions. I don't know, Vince, is that okay to do them now that related to the dashboard?
Sure. Amazon.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a question here that I'm just going to publish. Let's see how well this works. Okay, so everyone should be able to see that. So does your organization have a sustainability plan, a climate change plan, a carbon reduction plan, or something that is along those lines? And so to respond, you should be able to either, I think, I'm not sure if you can click directly on the stage, but you can certainly click in the pane on the right-hand side. Okay, I'm just going to hide it from the stage. It'll stay open there if you haven't had a chance to respond yet. I'm just going to hide that on the side and we'll go to the next question. You can still access it on that side. Okay, next poll question here. From what Vincent has shared with us today, do you see a potential application of the dashboard in your municipality?
Oh, I do see a question from, I'm just looking at the questions now, from Jay. Is there a concern with roadkill for habitat and road rights away? Yes, that is a concern. And there have been studies, but it's mixed. The results of the studies have been mixed. So it seems generally, if it's a road that is a low traffic use road or low speed road, for example, say a gravel rural road or something with very few cars on it, or maybe it's a road that has a 50-kilometer-an-hour limit or something like that, then that seems to be that there would only be a net benefit to restoring the rights of way along those roadways. So likely those would be a good start, a good place to start. But where there have been studies that have shown negative effects, and those tend to be on busy roads with a lot of traffic. And specifically also looking at road medians rather than verges. Road medians tend to have a negative impact when they're on busy roads, just because the insects are required to pass outside of those medians across the lanes of traffic to get to the medians, to other habitats. So it's at this point we still need to do more research on that. That's moving forward, one of the big questions is exactly what the impact is of restoration on insect populations. So it's not only, say you have a very busy road, you not only want to look at the number of insects that are that might have mortality on that roadway. You also want to look at the adjacent land and see whether that restored road verge has acted as a sink for populations to the adjacent land, or whether it's only net benefit because it hasn't acted as a sink, but overall there's more insects in those road verges. There might still be more mortality, but more insects in general. Um, and so that really seems to be a problem with busy roads, but um, and at this point it seems safe to be targeting low traffic use roads.
We have another question here. Also, just a kudos to you for a really awesome tool. But also, could agricultural producers also use this tracker to highlight areas and identify areas that are best to focus restoration? That's the first part. I'll ask the second part in a second.
Yeah, so for the modeling specifically, for the modeling, or I guess for the dashboard, sorry. So for the dashboard, it could be used for agricultural producers. It could definitely be adapted for that. Right now, it's targeted towards linear rights of way, so whether it's hydro corridors or roadways, but it could be modified to be able to include polygons as well, so farm fields and whatnot. That definitely could be possible. It would be a little bit easier if it's in very focused areas to do that, but it could be done at the broad scale of all of Ontario as well.
And to follow up with that, do you have layers for roads and utilities across Canada?
I do. There's a lot of data sets online. One of the better ones is actually provided by Stats Canada. If you're looking for just from the census data, they have roads and utilities. Utilities can actually be tricky. Hydro utilities, because it's provincial, there's a lot of you have to go province by province, and some provinces aren't as forthcoming with the information. It's not as easy to find. And then for a natural gas and oil pipeline rights away, that is nearly impossible to find in a downloadable database. There are some viewers online, but I guess that's a little bit more proprietary information, so it's difficult to get that information easily. But it is available.
And we have a raised hand here, so I'm going to hand you the mic. If it's a mistake, then just let me know. Okay, you're coming to the stage now.
Hi there. Thanks, Vince. This is great. I just have a question about the major highways, the 400 series highways in southern Ontario. Do you see those as a major barrier? And does this tool help identify safe crossings, 401, 403, things like that?
That's a really good question. So the tool could, sorry, going to the modeling could be used to try and identify areas where safe crossings should be implemented or are most likely to have a beneficial effect. Just looking at where the highest probability of roosts are, it's likely that that those are along corridors where monarchs are migrating during the day. So along those corridors would be good locations to try and make safe crossings along highways. And sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Oh, it just whether you kind of have evidence or whether you know that the 400 series highways act as a significant barrier or,
Right.
impact the population.
No evidence of that we have. I mean, it's very likely that they do, but we haven't been able to get that from our modeling. That's one thing actually. So one that is actually really nice that you brought that up. We haven't in our model we look at both urban roads and rural roads, but we don't distinguish between traffic use on the roadways. So that could be, and if that could be another future direction, is to look at actual traffic use and see whether that has an impact on migrant monarchs. Another thing is that some of these corridors, the highway corridors, seem to be used by monarchs in some locations. So I'm thinking of east of Georgian Bay. So there's some breeding areas for monarchs around Sudbury. There's some agricultural areas, and monarchs breed that far north. And then when they move south, they move along. We hypothesize they're moving along the east shore of Georgian Bay, and there are really two main migratory routes that they could be taking along there with suitable habitat along the way. And one is the highway, which when we were doing some surveys there, you could visually see migrant monarch moving along the highway. Not right over the cars or anything, but along the verges of the highway. And then the other is the big hydro corridor, the big north-south hydro corridor that runs close to the highway, where it's really neat. If you stand along the hydro corridor during migration, you can see migrant butterflies, monarchs passing south along there. So they are using these corridors, like the 400 series highways, in some situations. Whether it's more detrimental or not, really don't know.
Sorry, I realized my mic was off. Okay, we have another question here. And maybe Vince, if you can answer it. How far can monarchs travel before needing a nectar source or a place to rest?
So I'm not too sure the answer to that. I did read a paper that was looking at maximum distances traveled during the day, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was roughly in the ballpark of around 100 kilometers that they would go in a day. And that might not be every day, because some of the roosts will stay for several days at the same location. Whether it's the same monarchs that are staying there for several days, or whether it's just constantly monarchs in and out, then I'm not entirely sure we know that. But yeah, I'm not too sure as to how far they can go without needing nectar. If if we're judging by the Great Lakes as being a migratory barrier because they can't get nectar while crossing them, that's very possible. In which case, they're roughly, I think, 40 kilometers across or something. So presumably it'd be less than that. But they could also be migratory barriers for other reasons. For example, stronger winds coming off the shores, or there could be other numerous reasons why. So yeah, not entirely sure the answer to that, unfortunately.
If anyone on the webinar today has any insight into that, or maybe something that they've read, feel free to share that in the chat. And if not, we can try and distribute that after the call when the recording goes out. All right, it looks like that is the end of the questions asked. Let's see. I think that's all for today's. If you do, go home this afternoon and you're thinking about it more and you have any questions or you have some feedback about the tools that were presented today, feel free to share that with us. So like I said, there's a link for our email in the chat, right? ROW for Rights of Way Network at cwf-fcf.org. And so please do send that to us, because we would love to have that feedback and see how these tools might be applicable to your work. And otherwise, I just want to give a big thank you to Vincent for his time today and sharing these really awesome tools that we really hope are going to help make your restoration work as a rights of way manager more efficient and more effective as well. So thank you so much for joining us today, and we will be in touch soon with the recording.